Vasutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishna Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone. It's a lovely Sunday morning. A heads up on our March classes. We've got 2 Sunday classes in March. I know sometimes we have to do it on Mondays, but this coming month, 2 Sunday classes. Sunday, March 9th at 9:30 a.m. And you'll be happy to know, no homework assignment. And then Sunday, March 23rd at 9:30 a.m. here. And there most likely will be a homework assignment. And we're still just going through the verse of the Gita because the last chapter of Essays on the Gita that we read, Sri Aurobindo's book, covers all the way up to like 5.20, basically. And so until we get to 5.20, we're not going to read another chapter from Essays on the Gita. Okay, so that's the heads up. One part of our discussion in our last class was quite interesting, and I thought more about it regarding this discussion we're having with Anthony, Bindu, and others about the similarities and differences between the relationship between Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga in chapter 5, in the first few verses, in Sri Aurobindo's interpretation and in Swami Vivekananda's interpretation. And Swami Vivekananda says his interpretation is both Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga are direct and independent paths to liberation, right? What Anthony was suggesting, and I think Bindu also, and maybe some others, were, and in the study question responses, this was implied by some people, that Sri Aurobindo agrees with that, and then also says that these 2 yogas are integrally related to each other. And so on page 83 in Essays on the Gita, he actually says that in their integrality, each of these 2 yogas contains the other. And I think that's significant. And especially if you understand something about Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, he wrote an entire book, a fat book called Synthesis of Yoga. It's a very important book. And he calls his own sadhana, the one that he recommends, integral yoga. And it's one that integrates all these different yogas, bhakti yoga, karma yoga, jnana yoga, dhyana yoga, raja yoga, whatever. And the idea behind it being an integral yoga is that you find elements of each of the yogas in the other yogas, and it becomes this kind of fusion. I think fusion might be a better term, rather than just mixing and matching, but it's a kind of fusion of these. So I think that he adds an element of integrality to his interpretation of verse 5.4, which says, the person who sees knows that Sankhya and Yoga are one. He agrees with Swamiji that means that both these paths lead to the same goal, right? That's what we were talking about last time. I think Sri Aurobindo adds another dimension as well. This is along the lines, you've convinced me basically, which is that Sri Aurobindo adds a kind of, that the 2, Karma Yoga and Sankhya Yoga, are one in another sense, that they're integrally one in this sense that they each contain elements of the other, in that sense. Yeah? Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to mention before we plunge into 5.7 and following, those verses. And the study questions were based on 5.10. So at the very least, I want to get from 5.7 to 5.10, and then if we have more time, we'll continue a little bit. Okay. Here's the thing about Sri Aurobindo's overall approach to the Gita, and I think this is one of the unique features of his interpretation and his approach to this text, which differs from the approach of, as far as I'm aware, almost all the traditional commentators, but you can correct me if you think I'm wrong. Traditional commentators, what I find, Shankara, Raman, all of them, they don't tend to read this 700-verse scripture as a developing thought structure, like a sequential, like looking at chapter 1 as the beginning and then seeing how the thought structure of the Gita unfolds in the course of the 18 chapters. They kind of take the verses piecemeal. Sometimes there is some context. They do bring in some context, but this kind of seeing the entire scripture like a John Nash style. You get the reference here? Beautiful Mind. Come on, guys. John Nash, that famous mathematician. And it's like there's a scene where it's like seeing all these, like, he's making connections where ordinary people wouldn't be able to find the connections. So imagine this spiritual John Nash, and like these different, all 700 verses are in his mind at the same time, and he's kind of connecting them in this remarkable holistic way. So it's almost like every time he talks about a verse, he has in the back of his mind the other 699 verses at the same time. Right? It's just like massive contextual network kind of reading. I think it's a real virtue of his reading, but it also makes it difficult and challenging to figure out what he's actually trying to say. Now, why do I bring up all this in this context? Because Study question number 2 is about, I asked you to summarize Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of 5.10, Brahmanyadaya Karmani, about Karma Yoga. And there was an interesting range of responses. And where some of you think that, so the word Brahman, what does the word Brahman mean? This is in the to the bottom of the board here. Some of you say, yeah, Sri Aurobindo says that the Brahman is the impersonal non-dual self. And then others say, no, the Brahman is the Purushottama, the impersonal personal Purushottama. And then some other people say, there's a kind of tension, but like Sri Aurobindo is kind of moving back and forth, or kind of ambiguously or confusingly between taking Brahman in this verse 5.10 to mean the impersonal non-dual self, and then almost at the same time or in the same breath as the Purushottama. And one person, I think it was Don Salmon, one of the online, who goes so far as to say, like, couldn't we accuse Sri Aurobindo of either text torturing or kind of being confusing or ambivalent in kind of moving between these two things? I think this is an open question. I think it's tricky to read these, because I think, remember, that's why this overall approach is important to understand. Why don't we do this? Let's read 5.7, keeping this in mind what I just told you, and then we'll start. So 5.7, please open your apps and please repeat after me. Yoga yukto vishuddhatma vijitatma jitendriyaha sarvabhutatma bhutatma kurvannapi na lipyate. Okay, yoga yuktaha. This is the anvaya. So it's a rearrangement of the words. That person who is endowed with or equipped with yoga. And here it's a kind of union with the divine, karma yoga. Vishuddhatma, with a pure mind. Vijitatma, whose mind is conquered, who is exerting self-control, exercising self-control. Jita indriyaha, who has conquered his senses. He has full control over his senses. And then we get this really interesting phrase in the top of the board here is about this phrase. Sarvabhuta Atma Bhutatma. So Sarvabhuta means all beings. Atma, the Atma of all beings, Bhutatma. One whose Atma has become Bhuta, the Atma of all the beings, of all beings. That's literally what it means. But there are going to be some interesting subtle divergences in the way that different commentators interpret this specific phrase, which is very beautiful, poetically expressive in Sanskrit. Kurvan napi nalipyate. Even while acting, this person is completely free from all bondage and is not stained by nalipyate. He's not touched by the karmic effects of actions or any sin. Okay. Now, let's look at page 83 of Sri Aurobindo's comment. I'm going all the way back to a very early chapter. I don't know if you remember, way back we discussed a chapter called Sankhya, Yoga, and Vedanta. And so here he actually talks about these verses, and I'm going to read this to you. Okay. This is in the middle of page 83. His self becomes the self of all existences, of all things that have become. And even though he does works, he is not involved in them. So this nalipyate, he's not involved in it. He's not attached to the work. He doesn't get the karmic effects. He knows that the actions are not his, but nature's with a capital N. And by that very knowledge, he is free. He has renounced works, does no actions, though actions are done through him. This is important. So he has renounced works. That doesn't mean like Shankara style. He's physically renouncing actions. He becomes the self, capital S, the Brahman, capital B, Brahma Bhuta. He sees all existences as becomings of that self-existent being, his own only one of them. All their actions as only the development of cosmic nature, working through their individual nature, and his own actions also as a part of the same cosmic activity. Okay, let's pause for a second. Brahma Bhuta is a phrase that's used in different places in the Gita, but in chapter 18 it plays a prominent role. And his main argument is, when it comes up, there are two stages. Remember the terms jnana and vijnana, which come up in different parts of the Gita? Jnana is this Brahma Bhuta, becoming one with the non-dual Brahman, the impersonal non-dual Brahman. Vijnana, after you attain that becoming one with Brahman, you go on to attain the even more expansive knowledge of the impersonal, personal Purushottama. Okay? So here you might think, and I thought when I first read, he sees all existences as becomings of that self-existent being. This sounds a lot like Vijnana. You see everything as the divine. But then he goes on to say immediately after that, let's keep reading. This is really important. This is not the whole teaching of the Gita. Chapter 5. For as yet there's only the idea of the immutable self or Purusha, the Akshara Brahman. So he's already thinking of this chapter 15 of the Gita and the three Purushas. Kshara Purusha, Akshara Purusha, Purushottama. Okay, let's continue. And of nature, Prakriti, as that which is responsible for the cosmos. This is addressing the question that, or the kind of, what you said in your response. Okay. And of nature, Prakriti, as that which is responsible for the cosmos, and not yet the idea clearly expressed of the Ishvara, the Purushottama. As yet, only the synthesis of works and knowledge, and not yet, in spite of certain hints, the introduction of the supreme element of devotion, which becomes so important afterwards. As yet, only the one inactive Purusha and the lower Prakriti, Apara Prakriti, and not yet the distinction of the triple Purusha and the double Prakriti. Where is that mentioned? You guys are all experts now. And where is this triple Purusha and the double Prakriti mentioned? Which chapter of the Gita?
9?
No?
3?
No?
4.
Anyone else?
4.
Okay, this is now, let's just go through every 5, 6, 7, 8, 15. We haven't got there yet, so it's a kind of a hard question. But chapter 15 is called Purushottama Yoga. It's the doctrine of the Purushottama. That's where the triple Purusha and the double Prakriti is introduced. Apara Prakriti and Para Prakriti. And, actually, Apara Prakriti, Para Prakriti is already mentioned in chapter 7, and then it's brought up again in chapter 15. And it mentions that Mameva Amsho Jiva, every jiva, every individual soul is an amsha, a portion of the Purushottama. But the key doctrine here is this triple Purusha. Kshara Purusha, which is all beings, the divine Purushottama manifest as everything in this world. Akshara Purusha, the impersonal non-dual self. And then the Purushottama, the supreme Purusha, which is both impersonal, personal. Okay? So what's tricky about this is Sri Aurobindo is trying to honor the development of thought in the chapters, as the Gita itself unfolds. Do you see what I mean? So because the Purushottama concept has not yet been introduced, and the double Prakriti, this higher Prakriti, has not yet been introduced, he's still trying to work within the parameters of chapter 5. Do you see what I mean? So Gita's question, I'll just paraphrase it, was, well, his conception of Prakriti in these verses is kind of a Sankhyan one. It's just this kind of insentient nature. And, if we're trying to interpret these Gita verses in light of Sri Ramakrishna doesn't think that nature is insentient. There's Shakti, there's Divine Mother, who's working through nature, right? She ultimately is controller of nature and is nature, right? That's your objection. He fully agrees. And I'll convince you of this, I'm sure, shortly, because there's another page where he absolutely is explicit about it. Okay, and we'll read that soon. Okay, but now you're seeing the tricky aspect of this, is that he's saying, like, look, this karma yoga already presupposes certain concepts like the Purushottama, which the Gita itself has not yet introduced. And so he thinks that this is a kind of intermediate practice. It's a kind of, I would suggest this is my take on his overall interpretation of verses 5.7 to 13, which are all describing karma yoga. I see it as a kind of Advaita karma yoga, which sounds really weird and oxymoronic. Because from a Shankarite standpoint, that's impossible. There's no such thing as an Advaita karma yoga. There's karma yoga, then you purify your mind, and then you stop practicing karma yoga, and you practice Advaita jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, and then you attain moksha. I think what Sri Aurobindo is doing is saying that what the Gita is suggesting here, recommending at this stage, this early stage in the Gita in chapter 5, is a kind of Advaita karma yoga where you try to identify with the non-dual self. There's almost no bhakti element. I say almost. Why? Because of this 3.30 verse, which already kind of introduces the Purushottama idea and this bhakti-oriented karma yoga. Mai sarvani karmani sanyasyadhyatma chetasa nirashi nirmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. Krishna says, surrender all of your actions, give them up to me, and focus your mind on the inner Atman, and then you will become free and whatever. So that's these little hints. The Gita will already drop these little hints about the Purushottama, but you don't get the full-blown concept. Okay. So what Sri Aurobindo is doing, I would suggest, is this kind of Advaita Karma Yoga where just by brute force, by self-effort, you break your identification with the body-mind complex, recognize that it's part of nature, and you take a step back and identify with the non-dual self and tell yourself it's nature doing everything. And as yet, the Purushottama concept isn't yet in play, in a sense. This is the complexity of what he's doing. Okay, now, let's now read the next verse. The next two go together, 5.8 and 9. So let's read them together. Please repeat after me. Naiva kinchit karomiti yukto manyeta tattvavid. Okay, this is a tongue twister. Pashan shrinvan sprishan jigran ashnan gachan swapnan, it should be swapnan shwasan. Yeah, there's a kind of typo. I think there's a missing un. But anyway, shwapnan shwasan. These are all these little verbs, okay, like ing verbs. Okay. And then the next one goes with it grammatically, so we have to read 5.9 along with it. And more tongue twisters. Pralapan visrijan grinhan unmishan nimishan api indriyani indriyartheshu vartanta iti dharayan. Okay, we're done with the tongue twister. Yuktaha, that person who is in yoga. Now, in yoga, with what? Yoga means union, right? So with what? They have different interpretations. Sri Aurobindo will say in union with the Akshara Brahman, that impersonal non-dual self. Because again, he's trying to interpret this in terms of chapter 5. Purushottama is not there yet. Tattvavit, the knower of truth, the highest truth. Pashan, while, and then, okay, I'm not going to go to all that, well, I'll do it quickly. Even when he's seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, eating, moving, sleeping, breathing, speaking, taking things, ejecting things, opening his eyes, closing his eyes. What does he do? In the midst of all of these activities with the body-mind complex, Indriyani, the sense organs, he recognizes that it's just the action of the sense organs on sense objects. And that he is completely unaffected.
The witness.
He's the witness, right? This is what I'm calling this Advaita Karma Yoga. Because Shankara will say this is not a practice he recommends. Sri Aurobindo is saying, I think the Gita is suggesting this. Of course, you can bring in the bhakti element because the Gita itself allows that because it's mentioned in 3.30, as I already said, right? But there is a pure Advaita Karma Yoga practice as well, I think. That's what he's suggesting. And it goes back to his own biography, because in 1908, he's in Baroda in India. And Vishnu Bhaskar Lele was his first guru. And he taught him some meditation technique. And he claims that he realizes he attains the state of Advaitic Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And he becomes Brahma Bhuta. He becomes one with non-dual Brahman. And he sees this world as a cinematographic play of vacant form superimposed on the impersonal Brahman. It's a beautiful expression. But everything is mithya. Jagat is mithya. He sees the world as an illusion. And then he goes to jail for his political activities. And in Alipur, he has a kind of Vijnana realization where he says, I saw Vasudeva and everything. And the world is a real manifestation of the divine. So I think he's also thinking about his own spiritual experiences of jnana followed by Vijnana. Okay. Now, here, Sri Aurobindo has a very illuminating commentary on these verses. And I want us to read it carefully. And it again goes back to Gita's question/challenge. So let's read this. 186. Okay. There we go. Okay. The man who knows the principles of things thinks his mind in yoga and he adds his mind in yoga with the inactive impersonal. So we know that he's thinking of the Akshara Brahman here, the impersonal non-dual self. I am doing nothing. When he sees, hears, touches, smells, eats, moves, sleeps, breathes, speaks, takes, ejects, opens his eyes or closes them, he holds that it is only the senses acting upon the objects of the senses. Then his interpretation. He himself, safe in the immutable, unmodified soul, again clear that it's Akshara Brahman, is beyond the grip of the three gunas, Trigunatita. He is neither sattvic, rajasic, nor tamasic. He sees with a clear, untroubled spirit the alternations of the natural modes and qualities in his action, their rhythmic play of light and happiness, activity, enforced, force, rest, and inertia. This superiority of the calm soul observing its action but not involved in it, this Trigunatitya, is also a high sign of the divine worker. By itself, the idea might lead to a doctrine of the mechanical determinism of nature and the perfect aloofness and irresponsibility of the soul. But the Gita effectively avoids this fault of an insufficient thought by its illumining supertheistic idea of the Purushottama, introduced in chapter 15. It makes it clear that it is not in the end nature which mechanically determines its own action. It is the will of the Supreme, Shakti, which inspires her. He who has already slain the Dhritarashtrians, he of whom Arjuna is only the human instrument, a universal soul, a transcendent Godhead, is the master of her labor. So again, I see this kind of sequence of jnana followed by vijnana. The reposing of works in the impersonal. Notice the word reposing here. This is tricky when we get to 5.10. Why doesn't it say offering? Because you can't offer anything to the impersonal. It's not the kind of thing that you can offer things to. So he's being very careful about the language. Since he takes Brahman in 5.10 to mean the impersonal non-dual self and or Purushottama, we'll get to that. But if you take it as the impersonal non-dual self, you can't offer anything to the higher self, the non-dual self, because it's impersonal, inactive, non-personal. So he says reposing. Now, what exactly does he mean by that? We'll get to that. The reposing of works in the impersonal is a means of getting rid of the personal egoism of the doer. I see this as corresponding to jnana. But the end, so means versus end, the end is to give up all our actions to that great Lord of all. Sarva Loka Maheshvara. He's referring to a phrase in 5.29, the very last verse of chapter 5. And then he quotes 3.30. The one verse earlier, which actually gives a hint of bhakti and Purushottama, with the consciousness identified with the self, capital S. So that seems to be the non-dual self. Renouncing all thy actions into me. Here it's a Purushottama. So in one verse in 3.30, if you remember his interpretation, it has both built into it. You get the non-dual self, and then you also get the offering everything you're doing to the Purushottama. Mai sarvani karmani sanyasya adhyatma cetasa. Freed from personal hopes and desires, from the thought of I and mine, delivered from the fever of the soul. Fight, work, do my will in the world. So just be an instrument of Shakti. The divine motives, inspires, determines the entire action. The human soul, impersonal in the Brahman, is the pure and silent channel of his power. That power in the nature executes the divine movement. This is very subtle, these things that, okay. So he's saying on the one hand, you should identify with the non-dual self, the impersonal non-dual self. And that's a kind of jnana, the state of jnana. The further realization is vijnana, where you realize the Purushottama, the impersonal personal Purushottama, talked about in detail in chapter 15. But it's already mentioned as a practice of Karma Yoga in 3.30. Offer everything you're doing to the divine Purushottama. And then in chapter 15 we're told, Mamai Vamsho Jiva Loke Jiva Bhuta Sanatanha. Each of us as individual souls is an amsha of that Purushottama. We're all sparks, we're all portions of that divine Purushottama. And so from the highest standpoint of Vijnana, the greatest standpoint of Vijnana, we are, the Purushottama is working through us as his or her, I mean, because it's Krishna, he's thinking of he, but it could be Divine Mother also. We become pure channels, a pure and silent channel of the power of the Purushottama as jivas. And she's working through us in that way. It's just that in chapter 5, these ideas haven't been introduced yet. So I hope this addresses what you're asking. Okay, so now we get to the notorious / controversial 5.10. That's why I have a whole series of study questions just on 5.10, because it's really tricky to interpret this. Before I do, look at the middle of the board here, roughly middle of the board. Here's how I see how Shankara, who's the S, or Ramanuja, R, and Sri Aurobindo, SA, they're overall thinking about these different yogas in relation to liberation and how they interpret these verses in chapter 5 as a whole, starting with 5.7. According to Shankara, Karma Yoga leads to Chitta Shuddhi, purification of mind. And then we become eligible to practice JY, Jnana Yoga. And then we attain the liberative knowledge of the non-dual self, impersonal non-dual self. Okay, you all should be experts in that. You all know that. I've said it many times. But now, Ramanuja, you might be forgetting, and it is a little bit more confusing, Ramanuja's commentary. I see him as suggesting something like the following. Karma Yoga, and you can also combine Karma Yoga with Jnana Yoga, but remember, Jnana Yoga is not Shankara's, but it's meditation on the non-dual, not on non-dual, meditation on the individual soul, the Jivatma, separate from the body-mind complex, but it's not non-dual. Okay. So, but Karma Yoga by itself can also do the trick. That the culmination of Karma Yoga and or Jnana Yoga, or not and or, but yeah, and or Jnana Yoga is Atma Avalokanam. Realization of the Jivatma, the individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex. But that's not the highest goal. You don't get liberation through the realization of the Jivatma. Then you become eligible to practice Bhakti Yoga, BY. And then alone do you attain the highest liberative knowledge of Vishnu, his beloved personal god, Vishnu, Narayana. That's Ramanuja. Sri Aurobindo, this is how I take him to be interpreting these verses. Karma Yoga, when combined with Bhakti Yoga, and I think what he's saying is, that's why I'm saying is this kind of Advaita Karma Yoga. It's optional to combine it with Bhakti Yoga, but I think he strongly recommends. If you read the Gita as a whole, you find that the best Karma Yoga is a Bhakti-oriented Karma Yoga, like 3.30. But in these verses, you don't get the mentions of Bhakti. You don't see the Purushottam, and that's why he's kind of doing this tricky balancing act, and it gets tricky interpretively. So I think that what he's saying is either Karma Yoga without the Bhakti element, it could be a kind of pure Advaita Karma Yoga, or ideally, and even better, a kind of Bhakti-oriented Karma Yoga, and along with other devotional practices, which only come up later, especially in chapter 12 of the Gita. So that's what gets so complicated. This leads to the intermediate liberative knowledge of the non-dual self. Why do I say intermediate? It's liberation, great, that should be the highest. But he says, even beyond liberation, like Brahmanandaji, our first president, the first president of our order, he says, spiritual life begins with Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is a pretty tall order. Okay, so anyway, but this is what he calls Jnana. After that, you get the more expansive and greater knowledge of the impersonal personal Purushottama. Why greater? First of all, because it's a more expansive knowledge of the divine, as not just impersonal but also personal. But secondly, because of the compassion of the Vijnani, who stays in this world for, holds off on leaving the physical body in order to serve others. So like the Bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism. The Vijnani is like a giant log that can cross the river and carry all sorts of other creatures along with it, right? So that it's greater both in a kind of ethical sense as well. That's why he'll sometimes say the Jnani is selfish. Sri Ramakrishna would sometimes say the Jnani is selfish. He only cares about his own liberation. The Vijnani cares about all of humanity, right? Okay, so let's keep these paradigms in mind as we continue to discuss these verses, especially 5.10. So now, please repeat after me. 5.10. Brahmani adhaya karmani sangam tyaktva karoti yaha lipyate na sapapena padmapatram ivambhasa. Good. Anvaya, rearrangement of the words. Yaha, that person, sangam tyaktva, having renounced all attachments, sangam, brahmani karmani. Okay, and this gets tricky. Adhaya. Adhaya could mean offering. It could mean reposing, founding. It gets tricky exactly what adhaya means. But what are you doing? You're reposing or offering all of your karma, karmani, onto Brahman. And now what does Brahman mean? That's why we have the bottom part of the board. Different commentators have different readings. Saha, that person, ambasa, is like a padmapatram, a lotus leaf on the water, which means completely untouched. He's in the world, but not of it, not affected by it. Papena na lipyate. He is not stained by sin, by any sin, because he's the perfect ideal karma yogi. Okay, now we get to the study questions, we get to the different interpretations, and it's quite interesting, and so let's dwell on this for some time. And, okay, let's start with Shankara here. Shankara says Brahman here has to mean God. Why? Because this entire verse. Now, what's interesting is in 5.8 through 9, the previous verses which we just discussed, he takes these verses to refer to the realized soul. He takes 5.8 to 9 to refer to the person, the jnani, the realized soul, who has identified with, has realized his true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, as the non-dual self. And then all of this is just mechanical nature, insentient nature working out, even the body, even the mind of this jnani. Just let it do its own thing. Whatever it's doing, it's not me doing it. I'm the non-doer, the inactive self, capital S self, right? So 5.8 to 9 refer to the realized soul, the Jnani, who's already realized the non-dual self. Suddenly in verse 10, he's saying verse 10 refers to the ignorant person who has not realized the self yet and who is only eligible for karma yoga. All of you got this right in your answer to study question number 1, as far as I can tell. Okay. He's saying, so now, and a lot of you are kind of objecting, like, what's his justification, textually speaking and contextually speaking, for claiming that verses 8.9 refer to the realized soul, and then suddenly he shifts gears and says, but verse 10 is about the ignorant person. He does a similar thing in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. Verse 1, he says, refers to the realized soul, and then verse 2, suddenly he's saying is referring to the ignorant person. Because kurvan neve hakarmani jivishet. Verse 2 suddenly says, continue to do actions all your life. You should strive to live for 100 years. And he's like, oh my goodness, that's like anathema to Shankara. And so he says, no, that can't be right. So only ignorant people should strive to live for 100 years, right? But it can't possibly be the realized soul. Whereas Sri Aurobindo, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, they all say the second verse of the Isha Upanishad refers to the Jivan Mukta, the realized soul. Why should he strive to live for 100 years? To serve humanity. Again, that unselfishness and compassion of the Vijnani Bodhisattva comes in again. Okay, so all of you kind of, and I'm not saying all, I think most of you did kind of object to Shankara's interpretation of 5.10, saying that it's a kind of text torturing because there's no evidence that this verse suddenly refers to inferior spiritual aspirants, but that the previous 2 verses are referring to the realized soul. But Gita, for instance, and others say, but there is a good part of this, which is that he interprets Brahman as God, the personal God, Ishvara. And so it's this kind of nice bhakti-oriented karma yoga practice. And isn't that nice? And Shankara, the great Advaitin, teaching bhakti, a bhakti-oriented karma yoga. But at the end of the day, you know that, as Tapasanji puts it, he says, the sword of Damocles is hanging over our poor Divine Mother. So our personal God with Shankara. The moment Shankara comes, he's like, but that's all well and good. But the point of all this bhakti-oriented karma yoga is purification of mind. Then stop all your bhakti. Why? Why should you stop? Because it reinforces subject-object duality. God is different from me. I'm a bhakta, and then there's this personal God that I'm worshipping, who loves me and who listens to my prayers. Duality, duality, duality. So long as you're stuck in duality, you will not achieve the highest, according to Shankara. You see the logic, right? So there is a logic behind it. It's just whether you find that logic in the Gita is the question, right? Okay, so that's the Shankara interpretation. It's not me, but I have the same alarm, interestingly. Okay, so see, spiritual, it's the most spiritual of all the iPhone options. It's like this beautiful other ethereal like chime. Okay, anyway, Ramanuja / Swami Tapasanji, that's what's interesting. Some of you who don't know anything about Ramanuja weren't able to catch this. Swami, I asked you about Swami Tapasanji's interpretation of 5.10, that's study question number 3, right? What he's doing is he's basically channeling and endorsing Ramanuja's interpretation of Brahman in 5.10. Some of you got that. Ramanuja interprets Brahman in 5.10 as Prakriti, nature. And he has his own reasons for this. The main reasons are, you have to go back to this framework. Look at the middle of the board again. What's his overall scheme? Karma yoga plus jnana yoga leads to the realization of the non-dual self. And so he's not thinking about bhakti yoga yet. Because bhakti yoga only becomes prominent. He agrees with Sri Aurobindo on this. Only becomes prominent in the subsequent chapters of the Gita. Especially culminating in chapter 12, which is called what? Bhakti yoga. Not coincidentally. Right? And so he said, and he says that suits Ramanuja beautifully. Because both Sri Aurobindo and Ramanuja, interestingly, they say the first 6 chapters of the Gita really refer to Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, with a little Karma Yoga as well. And so the culmination is realization of the self. Ramanuja saying the individual soul, Shankara saying the non-dual self. But Sri Aurobindo says, you realize a non-dual self, but that's a precondition for the highest bhakti and realization of the Purushottama. And then they say chapter 7 to 12 are Bhakti Yoga. The emphasis becomes Bhakti Yoga. Right? Devotion toward the Purushottama, and then and then Sri Aurobindo says, what about 13 through 18? Karma Yoga, interestingly. But Karma Yoga in the highest sense, that compassionate Vijnani who's serving humanity and trying to help them out of spiritual ignorance as a Karma Yogi, even though they're completely liberated. Like Swamiji, like Vivekananda, Ramakrishna. Like, remember, Sri Ramakrishna scolds him and says, I thought you'd be like a great banyan tree. giving shade and shelter to thousands, right? You didn't come here for your own liberation. You already have that before being born. Okay. All right. So now, Swami Tapaswami in that, Ramanuja and Swami Tapaswami in this context, they see these verses as basically saying that Prakriti, body, mind are just doing everything on their own. And I am the Jivatma separate from this body-mind complex. This is the way that Ramanuja takes. This is not really offering. It doesn't make sense to offer anything to Prakriti in that sense. It's recognizing that Prakriti is the doer and that I am the Jivatma separate from the body-mind complex. This is how I take Ramanuja. And Swami Tapaswami kind of endorses this as well. Okay. At the end of the day, you end up with bhakti again, with Ramanuja as well, like with Sri Aurobindo. And you realize that Prakriti nature is not insentient, but that God is operating through Prakriti. God is the Lord of Prakriti. Nature is insentient, actually, I should say. But God is the ultimate doer. Yeah? Okay. And then Sri Aurobindo. Here we get to the most controversial part. Because there's a whole range of responses to study question number 3. And I'll just mention... Oh, study question number 2, sorry, on Sri Aurobindo, right? What is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of 5.10? Okay, so I'm going to mention a few of them, read out a couple of them. Parimal, online participant, says, he takes Brahman to mean the impersonal Brahman, as per page 186, which we read, and Purushottama, as per Onibaran Roy's book. And so he's feeling a kind of, and then he says, so he uses it interchangeably in both these senses. Non-dual self / Purushottama, and then I think his justification is, well, they're the same divine reality, but just seen from different aspects, maybe. And then Parimal says, according to him, reposing of the works in the impersonal is a means of getting rid of the personal egoism, right? I read that from 186. When works are reposed on the Brahman, and is not offered, notice reposed, right? Founded on. The personality of the instrumental doer ceases, though he acts, he does nothing. He gives up not only the fruits of his work, but the works themselves. The divine then takes the burden of works from him, the supreme becomes the doer, and the act and the result. So he's thinking of the end of the passage I read on page 186 to 7. And I think that is like a genuine question here. Like, to what extent is Sri Aurobindo reading the chapter 15 Purushottama concept already into these verses on Karma Yoga in chapter 5? And I think that there's this kind of ambivalence. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a clear understanding. One way that I could think of as reconciling these two things is that he's reading these verses 5.7 to around 12 or 13 as recommending primarily an Advaitic kind of non-bhakti kind of karma yoga. And then, but it also gives you the option of reading 3.30 into these verses, which allow a more bhakti-oriented karma yoga already in these verses, if you want. It's a kind of a matter of preference. And ultimately, bhakti, and the Gita is going to say, Krishna says, the best karma yoga by far, and the safest, and the most effective, and the quickest, and the swiftest is what? This bhakti-oriented karma yoga. You'll find that mentioned again and again, especially in chapter 12 of the Gita, but it comes up in many times. But he's doing this delicate dance between the impersonal Brahman and the impersonal Purushottama. Why? There's a method to his madness. As I said, it's because it's only chapter 5 of this 18-chapter text, and the concept of Purushottama and Bhakti has not yet really been introduced in a hardcore, full-blown way. And he's trying to honor that, the development of the thought structure of the Gita. Does that make sense? That's what I'm trying to explain. So I think Parimal is kind of seeing it that way too. I mean, I think he's moving in that direction. That it's kind of like an Advaita Karma Yoga culminating in Jnana, and then Vijnana comes described in a later chapter, something like that. But you can already offer whatever you're doing to the Purushottama if you so choose. Because you can also feel free to read these verses in terms of 3.30. Okay, Ellis says, according to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, when one's works are founded on Brahman, and then you quote directly from the text, the inactive, impersonal, immutable, unmodified soul, which clearly suggests the Akshara Brahman. I think Anthony also says it's the Akshara, I believe, yeah. And he or she has given up attachment to works and the fruits of works. He or she becomes Trigunatita, beyond the three gunas, and is able to perform works calm, observing, and without egoism, doing works but not involved in them. Okay. And so Ellis is kind of more pushing it in the Advaita Karma Yoga direction, as far as I can tell, right? Am I right? Gita, I can't read the whole thing. It's a long answer, but I think you are suggesting something. Well, you're bringing in the Purushottama concept already, I think, and then saying I'll read part of it. You're saying what makes one truly detached is letting go of the association of our actions with our ego, the sense of being the doer. The root cause of attachment must be abandoned to get ahead spiritually, because once one realizes they are not the doer, they cannot hold on to the idea of being owed something for their actions, like expecting something in return. But for those who still believe they are the doer or have attachments, they should repeatedly offer all their actions to God as an act of surrender or yajna. Yajna was talked about in chapters 3 and 4, especially chapter 4. This reduces attachment, purifies the mind, diminishes the ego, and accelerates realization, which leads to truly and continually living with the knowledge of not being the doer. So remember, I just want to remind you again of the kind of stages in our advancement in the practice of karma yoga for Sri Aurobindo. Number 1, we renounce the attachment to the fruits of our actions. Number 2, we renounce attachment to the action itself. That can be another kind of bondage, to be so attached to the work that we can't live without doing the work for 10 days or whatever. Third, we offer everything. This isn't actually, I don't want to say this is the third thing. The third is renunciation of doership. You don't feel like you're the doer anymore. 1 and 2 could still have a sense of doership with it. Right? You're renouncing attachment to the fruits, renouncing attachment to the work, but you still have a sense of doership. But the highest stage in karma yoga is you renounce doership itself. And the best and most effective way to do that is from the very beginning, from the outset, to offer everything you're doing to the divine, to the Purushottama. That's recommended in 3.30, even though it's not mentioned in these verses. Arguably, these verses presuppose 3.30. Okay? Anthony says, perfect inner peace and joy does not depend on the doing or not doing of works. Doing of works is an outward thing. All sin and all accomplishment are the products of ignorance and egoism. The sense of doership must be removed. There is no I or mine. No sin can cling to the divine worker who has abandoned attachment. Okay. And Karthik, for instance, one of the online people, says when one acts... Now there are 2 Kartiks. There's a second Karthik online. So I'm calling him Karthik 1 and Karthik 2. Okay. So Karthik 1 says, when one acts without attachment and either surrenders or is motivated to act by the Purushottama, one is not affected by sin, just as water does not cling to the lotus. So Karthik is pushing it more in the Purushottama direction. And so there was a whole range of answers. I think that Sri Aurobindo is kind of reading this Brahman as primarily as a non-dual self, as the impersonal non-dual self. But I think he's also hinting, but he's not very clear about it. I think that he could have been clearer. If you so choose, you can read 3.30 into these verses, and you can also read chapter 15, Purushottama concept, into it, and then do the karma yoga in a more bhakti-oriented way by offering everything you do to the Purushottama. And I think that it's not very clear at the end of the day. Now, there's a lot more I can say, but I think we need to move on. So let's try to get to a couple more verses, and then I want to get to a couple questions, or maybe even just one verse. Let's see here. Okay. I want to mention one thing too. This beautiful metaphor of be like a lotus leaf, which is floating on the water but completely unaffected by it. Like the drops just go right off it. Sri Ramakrishna, what's his analogy for this to householders? Be in the world but not of it. What's his analogy? Anyone? Not lotus leaf usually. It's something else. Mudfish. Be like a mudfish. You're in the mud and yet you're completely unstained by the mud. You can just shake yourself off a little bit and then gone. No mud. Okay. Now, verse 11. Please repeat after me. Kayena manasa buddhya kevalaihi indriyairapi yoginaha karma kurvanti sangam tyaktva atma shuddhaye. Okay. I'm going to try to come to Shankara's rescue to a certain extent by throwing him a bone here. Because I think what he's doing is he's seeing some justification for his interpretation of verse 10 as meant for inferior spiritual aspirants in verse 11, actually. Okay, so here's how he does this. But let's first, what is the face value meaning of this verse? Yoginaha kayena. Okay, I'll just read the translation. We don't have much time. The yogins, this is Sri Aurobindo's translation. The yogins do works with the body, mind, understanding, or even merely with the organs of action, abandoning attachment for self-purification, Atma Shuddhaye. Shankara pounces on this phrase, Atma Shuddhaye, and he's saying, see, the Gita itself, Krishna is saying in 5.11 that Karma Yoga is meant only for purification of mind. Who can be clearer? What can be clearer than that? Atma Shuddhaye. Karma Yoga is for Chitta Shuddhi. Okay? And then he's reading that back into the earlier verse and saying, so that we should also keep that in mind when we read 5.10. And when somebody engages in Karma Yoga, it's meant for Atma Shuddhi, purification of mind, which then makes you eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, and then you get the highest knowledge of the non-dual self. Eureka, QED. His case has been made. Now, and by the way, there's a verse in Vivekachudamani, which you studied in Mayavati, for instance. There's a famous verse about Karma Yoga. What does Shankara say there? Anyone? Chittasya shuddhaye karma natu vastupalabdhaye. Karma, action, and he's really thinking of Karma Yoga, is only for Chittasya shuddhaye karma. It's only for the shuddhi, for the purification of the chitta, of the mind. Just like this, Atma Shuddhaye. Natu vastupalabdhaye, not for the realization of the high self. Only Jnana Yoga can give us that. So in one little verse, he captures that. Shankara is reading this verse 5.11 with the same logic, and then he's going on to justify. He doesn't say it explicitly, but I'm being charitable here, and I'm trying to justify his interpretation of 5.10 in the same way. Now the interesting thing is, the exercise for you, my friends, is do you agree with Shankara here, or do you disagree, and why or why not? Yes, Anthony.
Is Sri Aurobindo's translation accurate?
I mean, it's always kind of this Victorian paraphrase rather than strictly word by word.
How do you, if you do works with the mind and understanding, that's Karma Yoga?
Definitely. This is definitely Karma Yoga, certainly that.
Well, I don't know. It's Jnana Yoga. I
see.
I think he's playing word games.
Well, but hold on. But think about it this way. You just talked to me. You just answered my question. Okay. Didn't you need to use your mind to answer the question? You had to process what I was saying and then answer it.
Absolutely.
So I think he means it in that sense. You use your body, the body-mind complex. You have to use the whole body. You can't, right? The only way for me to raise my arm is for the brain, the mind, to be actually I need to raise my. So that's so what's the?
An action, but
yeah,
is
exactly.
That action Karma Yoga?
It's still Karma Yoga because it's part of nature.
Jnana Yoga?
Again, this gets back to this kind of what exactly is Jnana Yoga and this and that, or what's so. Yeah, but I think that his understanding of Karma Yoga in the Gita, and I think this is plausible, is that both the body and the mind fall on the side of nature, Prakriti, and both are insentient. Right? The only difference between the body and the mind is the body is grossly physical and the mind is subtly physical. Okay. And Jnana Yoga is a practice that primarily involves the mind, but Karma Yoga is a practice that involves the whole body-mind complex. That's the way I think Sri Aurobindo is interpreting Karma Yoga in the Gita. Okay, now, but now, try to refute Shankara if you want to, or do you agree with Shankara in his interpretation 5.11? This verse 5.11 proves that Karma Yoga is only for Chitta Shuddhi and not for the highest knowledge of the non-dual self. Anyone want to take a stab? I've got my own take on this, or do you want me to just give my own take? Okay, I'm going to give my own take, unless you want to. Okay, all right, here's my take. Yes, the purpose of Karma Yoga is Chitta Shuddhi, purification of mind, but we can approach this from a different standpoint. This is kind of Swami Vivekananda standpoint, which I talk about in my book on Swami Vivekananda, chapter 2. There's a section in chapter 2 called The Four Yogas as Direct Paths to Liberation. Okay. Swamiji's view is, I'm just giving you an overview here without giving quotations and all that. I don't have time. He says, all four of the yogas are meant to purify the mind. That's not unique to Karma Yoga. Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Dhyana Yoga, Raja Yoga, and Karma Yoga are meant to purify the mind. Is he supporting Shankara? No. Why? He's now going back to verse 3.38 to 3.39 of the Gita, which talk about how the jnana, the highest knowledge of the supreme truth, is already within us. These are we already talked about these long back. That jnana is already within us, but that jnana is covered over by these layers of impurity. So through any of the four yogas, the purpose of all of these yogas is to remove those layers, those veils of impurity covering over our innate spiritual knowledge. And the moment we become sufficiently pure, what happens? That innate knowledge which is within us already manifests. And what I'm saying is, you might say, well, that's kind of like you're reading Vivekananda into these verses. That's why I'm saying, look back to, if we had more time, we'd look at the verses again. But 3.38 to 39, anyone who's interested, go back to those. So I see Swamiji as kind of Vivekananda, as doing this. Jnana is already with it. We don't need the yoga to generate knowledge. All we need to get out of the yogas is purification of mind. We already have the knowledge and we don't know it. We don't let that manifest because of the impurities. Purify our mind and we get the highest knowledge. And so what's the virtue of this reading of verse 11? It coheres beautifully with this, with the surrounding verses, the verses preceding and the verses following, because all of these verses are suggesting that through karma yoga you attain the highest. Right? So how do we interpret verse 5.11 in a way that's consistent with all these other verses before and after, which say again and again that through karma yoga you can attain the highest peace and the highest liberation? Well, because all you need then is purity of mind to get the highest liberation. That would be the logic. Are you following? It's a little subtle, but okay. So this is a way to interpret the same verse, agreeing with Shankara that the purpose of karma yoga is chitta shuddhi, purification of mind, but disagreeing with Shankara in saying that after purification of mind, you then have to practice the path of knowledge and then you get a liberation. That doesn't seem to cohere with the rest of the verses. A more plausible interpretation is all the yogas lead to purification of mind, and that knowledge is already within us. And it's allowed to manifest when you remove the veils of impurity covering over it. And so now let's pause here, and then I want to address some questions that some of you had.
I have a question about
Okay,
this.
please. Yeah, go ahead.
Could the difference be where he's interpreting the word only as going
Shankara, you talking about Shankara?
Shankara is saying that the only thing you get is the
Like
purity of
merely or something, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like the result of karma yoga is merely purification of mind, just like in the Vivekachudamani, where it says chitta, like karma yoga is only for purification of mind and not for the realization of the higher self. So he's reading a kind of only into it, which then you can argue with Shankara. That's a really nice point. You can say, I don't see the only there. That it's kind of like the purification of mind is not the highest, or that, and so that's nice. Yeah, you don't see, there's no word for only in the verse itself, where Shankara is kind of supplying that to justify his own framework, as I said, which is that one.
Was there a Kevalya sort of word?
No. Oh, Kevalite. Oh, no, that's Kevalite Indriyarapi. Yeah, that's using merely the sense organs.
Well, that's what I thought. Maybe sometimes they place a word somewhere else.
But grammatically speaking, that's in the third case, and it goes with Indriyahi.
Okay.
It goes with the sense organs. So that's a nice attempt, but and I'm trying my best here, but to defend Shankara, but I don't see it quite fully working out. So I like your point. It's just Atma Shuddhi, for the purification of mind, is what's literally said, and there's no only or merely, as far as I can tell, in the Sanskrit. Okay. Now we've got some questions here. Karthik number 2 says, I don't have any questions about this verse, but I have 2 questions about the relation between integral yoga and Vijnana Vedanta. And it's quite interesting, actually. So I wanted to, because this is a question that comes up again and again. One, and maybe I'll only get to one of them and then I'll go to other people. Sri Aurobindo talks about the transformation of the physical body as the ultimate goal of his integral yoga. And that's true. And if you look at his synthesis of yoga and life divine and stuff like that. However, neither Sri Ramakrishna nor Vivekananda talked about this. In fact, in a conversation with one of his disciples, Sri Aurobindo says, Ramakrishna's yoga was also turned only to an inner realization of the inner divine. Nothing less, but also nothing more. I believe Ramakrishna's sentence about the claim of the sadhak on the divine for whom he has sacrificed everything was the assertion of an inner and not an outer claim, on the inner rather than on any physically embodied divine. It was a claim for the full spiritual union, the God-lover seeking the divine, but the divine also giving himself and meeting the God-lover. There can be no objection to that. Such a claim all seekers of the divine have. But as to the modalities of this divine meeting, it does not carry us much farther. In any case, Sri Aurobindo says, my object is a realization on the physical plane, and I cannot consent merely to repeat Ramakrishna. This is a direct statement that Sri Aurobindo makes. He makes some similar statements elsewhere. And then Karthik 2 says, I think it's Karthik 2, it might be the same person writing twice, I don't know. But so when he himself says that his philosophy is different from that of Sri Ramakrishna, how can it be said that Sri Aurobindo's and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy are the same? This is a really interesting and important question, interpretively, because the class is called Bhagavad Gita and the Light of Sri Ramakrishna. My justification for using Sri Aurobindo's text all along has been, we don't have our own text written from within our tradition from the standpoint of Ramakrishna. The best we can do is Sri Aurobindo's text, because he was so strongly influenced by Ramakrishna, Now notice though, Karthik number 2, I never actually say that Sri Aurobindo's philosophy is identical to Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, and it need not be. In fact, I'm working on a book. I've started working on a book now on Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, and the very first chapter is devoted to these questions, where I'm kind of looking at the development of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, and he was more influenced by Ramakrishna and Vivekananda in the early stages. And then later, he starts moving a little bit further away and thinking more about how do we divinize this very earth? How do we literally divinize each physical cell in the human body? This is stuff that, as far as we can tell, as far as I can tell at least, Ramakrishna doesn't seem to talk about this. Vivekananda once, like sometimes gives little hints, but very little. But Sri Aurobindo, he really thinks that this is, and then the mother after him, his partner, his spiritual partner, then kind of continues that even and radicalizes it even further. So yes, I think Karthik number 2, you're absolutely right, that you don't find this idea of trying to divinize the physical body in Ramakrishna so much. You find it a little bit in Swami Vivekananda. But you do find it very strongly emphasized in Sri Aurobindo. But here's the catch. Remember that Sri Aurobindo is interpreting the Gita. It's a scripture. And there are other statements he makes about, I mean, this is how bold Sri Aurobindo is. He says, I've gone beyond the Gita. And he says that because Krishna also doesn't talk about the divinization or the transformation of the physical body, the spiritualization of the physical body. But I do. He says, I will not be constrained to any scriptures. I'll learn from all of them, and I'm going to, by the divine will, I'm also going to suggest a new sadhana that I think is useful for this age, and I think that it's useful and helpful and somehow greater in a certain sense to make this life here on earth divine. And part of that is divinizing the very cells of the human body, something that previous scriptures, previous saints haven't really talked about in an explicit manner in that way. Okay? It's a great question, though. Anthony, why are the interpretations so disparate? About 5.10, presumably. Why are they disparate? Well, that's if you talk about traditional commentators, because they're all trying to establish their system, right? And they need to interpret all these. They have to make the verse conform to their respective frameworks talked about in on the board here, or not talked about on the board, displayed on the board there. Parima. Okay, well, okay. Let me read Parima's. Pranam Maharaj. Please refer to Anirban Roy's book, chapter 5, verse 6. Do you agree with Sri Aurobindo's comment? The painful process of outward sannyasa, dukkhamaptum, is an unnecessary process. He's going back to 5.6, which we talked about in the previous class. Krishna is saying, remember, the overall gist of 5.1 to 6 is between these two paths, karma yoga and the path of knowledge. Both are good. Both can lead to the highest. But the path of knowledge is much more difficult, much more challenging, harder. Dukkham aptum. Sannyasastu mahabaho dukkham aptum ayogadha. It's very hard to attain renunciation of works without yoga. Ayogataha. Okay? Dukkham aptum. And so Parimal is asking about this phrase. Because Sri Aurobindo renders this as the painful process of outward sannyasa, dukkham aptum, is an unnecessary process. And then Parimal asks, do you think this is the correct interpretation? Which word in the original Sanskrit verse can be translated as unnecessary? The verse simply means that for a person not established in yoga, mere outward renunciation will be painful. Sri Aurobindo did not believe in outward sannyasa, so he thinks it is unnecessary, but that is his thought and not in this verse. Is he then not reading his own thoughts into the text? So he's saying, is he guilty of text torturing or eisegesis in doing this? The thing is, his translation, the direct translation, actually, as far as I can tell, it's in Anirban Roy, page 91. But renunciation, O mighty armed, is difficult to attain without yoga. And I think that's a more literal interpretation, rendering of the words dukkhamaptum. It's just difficult. It's very hard to attain without yoga. That's accurate. Then Sri Aurobindo goes on to interpret that difficulty in terms of it being, he says, the painful process of outward sannyasa, dukkhamaptum, is an unnecessary process. And so I think that Sri Aurobindo kind of is doing both things. He's giving the literal reading, but then he's adding this layer of interpretation on it and saying that you don't have to. I think his interpretation, though, is consistent with verses 5.1 to 6, which is that you don't need to renounce actions at any point in your spiritual life. From the very beginning, you can be a karma yogi, all the way up to the very end. You never have to actually stop actions. Because the more evolved you get in karma yoga, the more of a bhakta you become, the more you're able to renounce not only the fruits of your actions, but even doership. And at that point, you just become a perfect instrument of the divine. And that's what I see. The context is really important here, and I think that's what Sri Aurobindo has in mind here. Patty asks, and any of you can chime in too. I don't want to let the online people monopolize here, but following your lectures, she's talking about the whole like overarching. Like I gave a talk here on do we have free will long back. Following your lectures, I just finished Sapolsky's book Determined. I mentioned Robert Sapolsky's book Determined, a Stanford professor. The book is inspiring, and Sapolsky himself says how he fails to live up to his own conclusions every day, even though he tries hard. Meaning he can't, even though he believes that we don't have free will, he can't help but feel that he's free. Something very much like what Ramakrishna says. I believe Sri Aurobindo would call this the problem of mechanical determinism. Is that why the Gita posits Purushottama? By holding on to the divine being as opposed to just determinism, we will therefore be able to practice the principles of detached action. I think this is great. Yeah, I mean, she's almost reading these verses as a kind of corrective to or a critique of Sapolsky's atheistic conception of an argument for radical determinism, that we have zero free will. Sapolsky and Ramakrishna agree we have zero free will. But Sapolsky doesn't posit a Purushottama or God at the beginning of the causal chain, whereas Sri Ramakrishna does. And Patty, I think, really cleverly suggests that for this reason, you find that Sapolsky's not really able to, I mean, it's not dissing him, but it's like not much of it doesn't seem to have a robust spiritual practice, and he keeps falling into the same problem, is that I know intellectually that I have no free will, and yet, I'm the same old person that I always going to Stanford every day, waking up in the morning, and then, and so she's saying to make spiritual progress, you need to bring God, the divine, into this equation. And then ultimately you realize the Purushottama is the sole doer. And then you can make progress as a spiritual aspirant, as a karma yogi, doing this bhakti-oriented karma yoga. So I think that's really nice, Patty. Thank you. I already addressed Gita's question, I hope. And then Vikas, what else we got here? Okay, how about this? I'll try to address one more question maybe. It's a very subtle point Vikas is making here from London. There was a discussion raised in the class about what renunciation of action actually is, which is a huge problem I had in my initial study of Advaita Vedanta 2, Shankaras. Over time, my understanding is the following, and now this is Vikas's understanding. The sublation through knowledge of the actions of the body, etc., superimposed on the actionless self through ignorance, is itself what is called renunciation of all actions. This is very subtle. So now, Vikas says, karma sannyasa is then not actually the giving up, the physical giving up of actions, but rather the sublation, the badha of the action, which is superimposed on the nishkriya, the inactive atman, through jnana, knowledge of the non-dual self. Thus he says, this is his interesting creative interpretation of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Thus, jnana yoga, shravana, manana, nididhyasana, and karma yoga can be complementary. If I remember correctly, Shankara is also objected to regarding Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana being injunctions, and he says, well, actually, let's just pause here. So he's saying that even in the path of, even in the practice of karma yoga, of jnana yoga, the path of knowledge according to Shankara, there's a way of interpreting classical Advaita Vedanta that allows you to never to actually physically renounce actions. And he's saying there's a different way of interpreting karma sannyasa, that you renounce actions, but it's a mental renunciation and a recognition that you are the non-dual self separate from the body-mind complex. And you realize that the body and the mind are all unreal. But that doesn't mean that you stop acting. And verses 5.8 to 9 kind of, you can interpret them in that way too. And even Shankara says the realized soul realizes that the body-mind is just doing, it's just nature working, right? So,
there's an inward renunciation.
yeah, but no external renunciation. That's one possibility. I, however, would suggest that if you actually look at Shankara's commentary, there are too many places where he is encouraging not just inward sannyasa, like mental, but also physical renunciation, and especially with regard to these verses. He says, for instance, let me read, page 204 of Gambhiranandaji's translation of Shankara's commentary on 5.9. For the man who has known the truth thus, who finds nothing but inaction in action, in all the movements of the body and organs. So that's more along the lines of Vikasa's interpretation. And who has full realization. There is competence only for giving up all actions. So here I take Shankara to be saying the physical giving up of all actions, because he's giving a justification, because of his realization of the non-existence of actions. Then he gives a really sensible metaphor. He goes, indeed, one who proceeds to drink water in a mirage, thinking that water is there, surely does not go there itself for drinking water, even after knowing that no water exists there. He says, look, if you don't know it's a mirage, then obviously you're going to, and you're thirsty, you're going to want to go to that mirage water. The moment you find out it's a mirage, aren't you going to stop? So I think he's actually also suggesting physical renunciation of actions. That's Vikas. Okay, it's 10:40. I've got a Sunday talk. Who do we become? Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thank you, everyone. Next class, Sunday, March 9th at 9:30 a.m. Here. Be here or be square.
You're not going to India?
I am.
Thank you.
March 24th is when I'm going to
So
India.
did you copy it or whatever? So
Will you be available
We might
after?
not need it.
oh, we
your
may
talk?
not need it. Okay.
After the Sunday talk?